Hi, everyone. It's Jean Sachs. I'm the CEO of Living Beyond Breast Cancer, and I am really excited because today I have the opportunity to talk to Kate Pickert, who is the author of Radical, The Science, Culture, and History of Breast Cancer in America, the book that I have kept by my side for quite some time now. So Kate, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me, Jean. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Great. Kate was a former writer for Time Magazine, and she's now a professor at Loyola Marymount University in California. And she was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 35. So wrote this book both from a journalist perspective, but also from her own perspective, living and experiencing breast cancer. I have to say, when I read this book, and I read it, and I'm not kidding, in one sitting, I felt like Kate had chronicled much of my professional career, because I have been working in the breast cancer advocacy community since the early 90s. And you did such an amazing job of capturing a really, really complex, how the science has evolved. We've made step forward, steps back, the advocacy. So as soon as I finished it, and I think you, as you know, I sent you a note on LinkedIn. I sort of felt like a fan stalker, but I was like, I need to talk to her, and you were amazing. You got right back to us and participated in our conference. So thank you both for writing this book and for being so good to Living Beyond Breast Cancer.
Well, thanks so much for reading. And also, it's great to hear from someone who was really there for a lot of the turning points in the book. If you feel like I got it right, that's very heartening to me, because I was, of course, looking back on a lot of this stuff, as history, because I was young, but also I just hadn't been involved in breast cancer at all, really, aside from writing a couple of stories about it over the years. It wasn't, a main topic for me. So I had to do a lot of research and reporting. So that's great to hear from you, Jean. Thank you. Humbly, I appreciate
and I know
it.
your research really went back to the 1800s. So just want to say I wasn't around then, but
I know.
It was actually really helpful to have how you did the deeper history and how decisions were made. So anyway, Kate is also going to join us for our upcoming conference called Wellness and Wisdom, and it's going to be October 24th and 25th. So you'll have a lot of chances to hear more from Kate. So Kate, let's start right away, because I know your book is coming out in paperback, which means more people can buy it. So we're excited to tell people more about the content. So as we said, you cover an expansive history of the changes in medicine and advocacy. So share with us just a few of the key takeaways about how breast cancer treatment has evolved and changed.
Yeah, I think that the biggest step forward is the scientific discovery that there are many different types of breast cancer. This is a key and critical, absolutely critical turning point to get us sort of where we are today. So, doctors have been treating breast cancer with surgery for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But for most of the history, human history that we have recorded, it was thought that breast cancer was a single disease. And so the discovery in the middle part of the 20th century that a drug could be developed specifically for breast cancer that is fueled by estrogen, for example, which is the majority of all breast cancer cases, are some type of this particular subtype that is fueled by estrogen. So that was a discovery that was made in the early 20th century, late 19th century. But that discovery allowed treatments to be tailored specifically for that type of breast cancer, which is really the key to treating that type of breast cancer. Years later, there was a discovery of another subtype of breast cancer called HER2 positive breast cancer, which after the discovery of that, the great thing was a drug could be developed, a targeted drug specifically for that type of breast cancer. So if I had to choose one important scientific step forward with breast cancer, it's figuring out that there are different kinds and that they all need to be treated slightly differently in order to improve outcomes. So I think that's the biggest scientific advance. I will say also, I think that the patient experience has really improved, particularly over the last 20 years or so. I think that doctors and the real heroes of cancer treatment, nurses, have gotten really a lot better at treating side effects and anticipating sort of what the, for example, chemotherapy or surgery recovery experience will be, and doing more to inform women and help them sort of get through those phases as well as possible. And, you know, also if we're talking about something that's changed, I mean, more women are surviving breast cancer than ever before. So the mortality rate for breast cancer in this country is ticking down a little bit every year, very consistently. It's not as fast as we would like, but we are making progress inch by inch continuously every year.
Right. That's a great overview. And I agree with you. I still am amazed every time I talk to a newly diagnosed woman. They have no idea that breast cancer isn't one disease.
Right.
So, you know, that when you're diagnosed, you have so many decisions to make. And I know that, you know, you experience that as well. And I think your book really helps put it all into context. So I think it's so valuable for everybody to read, but particularly those that have been diagnosed. So in your book, you talk about some of the changes that have happened, including what some people might call the de-escalation of treatment. I mean, I like to think of it as, you know, more isn't always better. But, you know, I think when you're diagnosed with cancer, your first reaction is, I want to do everything I can. I want to hit it as hard as I can. So tell us what that really means.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from firsthand experience. When you hear a diagnosis of breast cancer, hear that you have breast cancer, it's very scary. And you have not a lot of time to sort of learn about the disease and learn about treatments. And you have to become sort of an expert in a short period of time if you want to have any agency over how your treatment you know, sort of unfolds. And it's hard to get your mind around it enough to think, well, maybe I don't need to do everything. Maybe I don't need to throw everything but the kitchen sink at this. Maybe there's a smarter way. It's really hard to get to that place. So I'm very heartened that in the oncological community, there is an effort kind of under this umbrella of de-escalation, of figuring out, and there's a lot of science being done and that has been done on this, about sort of what's the least amount of treatment we can give to still get the best possible outcome. And so that's like a driving philosophy behind breast cancer treatment now. And I think it's amazing. So, for example, you know, does every woman need chemotherapy for breast cancer? No. And in fact, there was a huge study that came out just a couple of years ago, a great long-term study called the Taylor-X study, which basically, I talked to the author of the study for my book, and he said, yeah, we expect 60,000 fewer women a year to get chemotherapy for breast cancer just in this country alone because of the results of that study. So this idea of like taking things off the menu, whether it's a big surgery or, you know, and instead replacing it with a smaller surgery, maybe no chemo and instead targeted drug therapy. So that's kind of the de-escalation overview. And the pharmaceutical companies are working really hard with that philosophy in mind too, trying to develop targeted, more drugs that are more gentle than chemotherapy, which is of course indiscriminate and wreaks havoc on your body far beyond wreaking havoc on the cancer cells itself.
Yeah. And I think what's been minimized is the impact of treatment on your quality of life afterwards. You know, it's just been, you know, so really looking at, let's treat this effectively, but let's minimize the long-term side effects. I think we still hear from newly diagnosed women that's very confusing. They still think, you know, let's cut it out. That's the first thing to do. So I know another big change that you document is neoadjuvant chemotherapy, which I still think is confusing to people. So,
yeah. Yeah, and I'd love to just explain briefly. Yeah, I mean, neoadjuvant, I mean, and your audience may be really familiar with that term, but neoadjuvant just means, well, let's give the drugs, including chemo, before surgery so we can see if they worked and how well they worked. Because if you cut a tumor out, then you really have no proxy, no way of sort of measuring the efficacy of the chemotherapy or other drug treatment. So it's common still to have surgery first, but there's definitely a lot of oncologists rethinking that sort of traditional order of treatment because we can learn so much by treating cancer neoadjuvantly. And I write about this in my book, and I write about it in my case. So I had 5 months of neoadjuvant therapy, chemotherapy, as well as a targeted drug given intravenously. And then I had surgery. And actually in my surgery, there was no cancer left. It had all been killed off. Now, today, there's no way to know that unless you do the surgery and take it out. But one of the questions that came to my mind was, what was the point of this surgery? From a medical perspective, right? Like it didn't improve my health. It did give us information, which was critical. But that's a question that's kind of cutting edge. And there are doctors kind of looking at that as well with neoadjuvant therapy. Can we somehow figure out through biopsies or imaging if we can maybe avoid surgery, even for women who have like really aggressive, dangerous types of breast cancer? So that's not going to happen this year, but that's sort of like one place where there's a lot of science ongoing. And I think it's really exciting.
It's so exciting. And it's also a real re-education of the American public, because not just the way we've sold mammograms, we've sold surgery, we've sold bigger surgeries. So I think there's a big learning curve. Mm-hmm. That's why you have to read Kate's book, because really you'll dig into this and it'll make a lot more sense. I have so many sections highlighted just to go back. And even though I feel like I know a lot about breast cancer, it's really going back and understanding, pulling all the threads through. Mm-hmm. So in your book, you talk about some of the superstars in medical oncology. And we thought maybe you could share, some of your favorite.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's probably two people that really have done a lot to change the way I think about science around breast cancer. So one is Dr. Dennis Slayman, who's pretty well known in the breast cancer community. He's been around for a very long time, and he is based at UCLA, where I was treated, but that's not what makes Dr. Slayman incredible and a superstar. It's that, and I don't think this is a coincidence, but Dr. Slayman was right at the center of development for two of there aren't very many breakthrough drugs in breast cancer, but two of them have come out of Dr. Slayman's lab, or he's been intimately involved in the process. So one is Herceptin. He was very involved in the development of that drug that ended up being produced by Genentech in the 90s into the early 2000s. And also, Dr. Slayman was integral in getting CDK4/6 inhibitors kind of to the fore. And these are drugs like Ibrance, which has been kind of a game changer for a lot of women with metastatic estrogen-positive breast cancer, and is, I think, probably on the road to being used more even for early stage patients with estrogen-positive breast cancer. So Dr. Slayman has been really good. He's stayed in academia. He works in an academic lab, but he collaborates with drug companies, and he's been someone who's, played big roles in the development of some really critical drugs. And the other doctor, I think a lot of people think of this doctor when they think of kind of big names in breast cancer, is Dr. Laura Esterman, who's at the University of California, San Francisco. And Dr. Esterman is controversial, and she's not afraid to say things that might upset people, but to try to upend some paradigms in the way we think about breast cancer screening, that neoadjuvant therapy, like you were talking about, and drug development. And I think Dr. Esterman is really smart. And she also went to business school along the way. And so I write in the book about how she's applied market research and sort of teamwork principles and things like that to how she approaches. She has a leadership role at UCSF. She runs a big trial, a couple of big trials, actually, a couple of big, really important trials. So she's changed a lot about the way I think about screening and treatment for breast cancer. So Dr. Esterman and Dr. Slayman, I don't think we would be where we are in terms of treatment or in terms of a more modern way of thinking about breast cancer without those two. So
yeah, you pulled out two great people. Of course, even though I know you're from New York, you're showing your West Coast bias, because you do also talk about many of the East Coast doctors and just some of the divide about the East and West Coast doctors and how they approach treatment, which we won't give that away. We'll make people read the book so they can learn that. So in addition to interviewing so many doctors, you also talked to patient advocates and really shared their stories. I mean, just thinking about Herceptin, some of the women that chained themselves to Genentech's fence to get Herceptin, and how advocates have really made a difference. So share a little bit about what you learned about the breast cancer advocates.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when we think about, you talk about the 90s, Jean, and, the 90s was when a lot of the big breast cancer advocacy organizations were founded or really came into their own. Everything from the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, Avon, Komen. And so those folks were trailblazers, right? And the pink ribbon and all of that stuff. I'm critical of it, about the pink ribbon kind of culture in my book. But I do think it was a symbol that did galvanize a community of women to say, like, hey, we need to, make our voices heard, talk about what we care about, raise awareness among our sisters and some brothers around the country about the risks of breast cancer. So I think there's a very rich history of advocacy in breast cancer. But I also think in the last 5 years, it's really modernized and become more targeted. I think that advocacy organizations are looking at issues that really need attention. So not issues like screening. Like, screening is pretty well understood. We can still get rates better, particularly among certain populations that have lower rates, which can be problematic, even though screening itself is, nuanced and a complicated topic. But many of them have pivoted from just pushing that to pushing, like, research for triple negative breast cancer, which is a subtype that can be very deadly, and we don't really know how to treat it very well yet. That's a place that needs targeted funding and attention. They focused even more in recent years on women with metastatic disease, who typically were not a focus of advocacy organizations. I have to hand it to the stage 4 advocates, women who are themselves diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer and are out there on social media or doing a die-in on the lawn in front of the Capitol, doing all kinds of things to get attention and raise awareness for those issues. So I think that advocacy has really helped shape the direction of science in a lot of good ways. I just, hats off to, like, all of the women who went through so much personally and then decided to kind of use their experience to help other people down the line. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so well said. I mean, for those that are newly diagnosed, everybody is a beneficiary of those that
Yes.
came before them, and really the bravery that they just went through.
Mm-hmm.
So I know when you were writing this book, you weren't just writing it as an author. You also had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and you'd been diagnosed young.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think that impacted your ability to
Mm-hmm.
report on it?
Yes. I mean, I would not have been able to do a good job writing a book like this if I hadn't been through it myself. And I know this because I had written a couple of stories about breast cancer before I was diagnosed. I covered healthcare for Time magazine. I didn't really write a lot about science and medicine specifically. I mostly wrote about healthcare policy and insurance and the Affordable Care Act, some politics and things like that. But along the way, there had been a few issues about breast cancer that had kind of come into the policy and political realm. I'd written a few stories, but within a couple of weeks of my own diagnosis, I realized I don't know anything about this. And to be frank, I felt even a little embarrassed that I had written about it, not knowing so much about it. So that's what made me want to write the book. Was I thought, oh my gosh, I am learning so much in these first couple of weeks. Things like, oh, there are different types of breast cancer. I don't necessarily have to lose my hair, even though I'm going to get chemo. I could still maybe have kids down the line. What? Like all these things that I wasn't aware of. And so I felt like, okay, if I don't know this stuff and I'm a healthcare reporter, surely there's an opportunity to educate other people. And there really wasn't a book that had come out like in the last 10 years that told these stories of the history and context behind sort of what's happening now. I think the other part of my experience that was good for the book is, I understand the emotional aspect of being a breast cancer patient and of just breast cancer itself. And it is an emotional disease on a lot of levels. We're talking about sisters, mothers, daughters, doctors are emotional about it. Patients are emotional about it. The general public is emotional about it. And so I think I experienced a lot of my own emotions through it too. And I think that gave me I knew how to talk to breast cancer patients about what they had been through too, because of my own experience. So, I think it was just really helpful. And most of the book is not about me, but it was really important to share my story in the book so that readers could understand where I was coming from, that I did have a bias, obviously. I had a personal stake in the story.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
you weave through your experience in a way that I think is really relatable. So I think you do a great job with
Thanks.
that. In one of your chapters, you talk about when you went to the big medical oncology meeting, the San Antonio Breast
Mm-hmm.
Cancer Symposium, which is, we always say, like where you have to be if you're
Yes.
in breast cancer, and you met Leanne Kramer,
Mm-hmm.
a young woman living with metastatic breast cancer. And I know you spent time with the metastatic community. So tell us what you learned from that. And you've already touched a little bit on it, but maybe tell us a little bit
Yeah.
more.
Leanne is an incredible person. There's a whole chapter in my book about her. We're still in touch. She's still doing okay, Leanne. She's an amazing person. But yeah, through Leanne and other women in her shoes that I spoke to, I learned a couple of things. One, there's not nearly enough science about metastatic breast cancer. There are very few researchers devoted to studying that form of the disease specifically. And it's different than early stage breast cancer in a lot of respects. It's different maybe on a chemical and molecular and biological level, and those patients are facing something that's very different than an early stage disease. So I think that for a long time, the scientific community, treated these women, but also kind of wrote off the idea that their lives could be saved. And I think over time, there is a real questioning of that conventional wisdom. Some women diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer can survive for a really long time, sometimes more than a decade, sometimes even longer than that, right? And that's that's a whole shift in how we think about this. So I learned there was not enough science. I learned that the treatment's gotten a lot better. It's no longer an automatic death sentence, a stage 4 diagnosis in breast cancer. And I also learned about, when you talk about advocacy, those ladies, wow, they are, despite everything they're facing, they are highly organized on Twitter, on Facebook. They hold conferences, they raise money, they get on panels. They're really all over the place when it comes to the world of breast cancer conferences and things like that. So they've done a tremendous job of bringing light to this. And I just wanted to bring a lot of light as well to that topic specifically, because very little's been written about it. There's so much been written about early stage, but metastatic hasn't been written about very much, at least in the popular press.
No, you're right. And I think that, that is the breast cancer that kills people, and they don't, a lot of people don't realize that. They're like, what's metastatic breast cancer? And I agree, the advocates they're fearless, and as many women can do well. They can switch treatments. Some can do well on one treatment for a really long time, but their road is different because they're always in treatment. And so that really does lead into our fall conference, where you're going to moderate a panel called Early Stage Breast Cancer and Metastatic Breast Cancer, Being Allies for Each Other. And I think this is such an important topic, because I think for so long, if you had early stage breast cancer, the last person you wanted to meet was someone with metastatic. That was exactly who you didn't want to be. But what we're starting to see, and in some ways, if you're metastatic, you don't want to see the early stage person.
Right.
We're starting to see more support and more understanding, which I think is so important, because that's going to help move the needle. So what does it mean to you to be an ally for the metastatic community?
Yeah, I think that I don't consider myself an advocate. I am a journalist. I'm not an activist. I consider myself someone who is documenting what's happening, and then maybe trying to ask some provocative questions based on the perspective I've gained through a lot of learning and research and reporting. But I think that if there is an allyship between someone like me and the metastatic community, or just the breast cancer community in general, it's to shed light, right? It's to educate other people. It's to get the message forward in a different way, right? So my role as a journalist, I think, has a certain type of power that an advocate doesn't have, right? Because I'm sort of taking everything into consideration, trying to contextualize, et cetera. So, one of the ways I'm trying to be an ally is write a chapter in my book about metastatic disease. Then I was able to get a book excerpt to run in Time magazine when the hardcover came out, and the chapter we chose was the chapter about metastatic disease. So even folks who didn't read the book may have seen that. I have a story coming out next month in Elle magazine about metastatic breast cancer. So I'm trying to write about it and be an ally in that respect. And then also I love to come talk to folks like you and, help facilitate dialogue and further education. I mean, that's my job as a journalist, is to get conversations going and to, help hopefully make people a little bit smarter.
Yeah. And I think that's great, because I have to say, it really hasn't been that long. It wasn't that long ago when people really didn't ever talk about metastatic, and, a lot has changed in the last 5 years, but it really wasn't that long ago. And so we do have to keep, just keep that pressure on so that people really do understand what metastatic breast cancer is and how it is different and the kinds of support they need. Because many women living with metastatic don't look sick.
Right. Yeah.
And, I know that it's a horrible thing when you say, oh, you look great. And they're like, really? Well, I've got cancer like in my liver, my lungs, my brain, but, it's not so visible to sort of the general public. So before we end, tell us how people can get your book and any other reasons why they should read it.
So the hardcover comes out, I think, September 29th. And you can pre-order it on Amazon. I'm also a big fan of indie books or ordering from your local independent bookstore. Independent bookstores are suffering mightily with the pandemic. So the list price, I think, is the same on Amazon or an independent bookseller website. It might be like $2 more on Amazon, but Amazon doesn't need your money. But the independent bookstore might. And then it will, I don't know what bookstores are open across the country, but it will be in physical bookstores as well nationwide. So pre-order it now. And thanks a lot for having me. And I'm thrilled to think that, the book could gain a new audience through the paperback edition, and that it can keep going on and keep living as a resource for folks. Yeah.
Exciting. And I will just say that I think this book is a quick read, and it's, if you're interested at all in, sort of science and how things happen and how we step forward and then move back. I mean, it's almost like a thriller in some ways.
Yeah.
Really well written, really engaging. So Kate, we so appreciate you sharing your insights, your knowledge, really being there for the community. And as you said, you're not really an advocate, you're a journalist, but I think it's the journalists that amplify these stories. And without people like you, we just don't get the messages out. And we really look forward to, having you at our virtual conference, October 24th. So everybody look for that. And then anyone who's listening who needs immediate support, remember, we have closed Facebook pages. Just log on to lbbc.org, ask to be joined, and we'll connect you with one of those communities so you can get support in real time. Otherwise, I wish everybody well, stay safe, and stay healthy.
Thanks, Jean, for having me. And thanks for all the work that you and LBBC do too, to help a lot of people on a wide scale.
Thank you.